for king and country.
Do not imitate me. I have loved war too much.
God, my reign, was it enough?
Hey guys, tonight I'm going to tell you about one of the most dazzling kings Europe ever had. The man who built the Palace of Versailles and ruled as if he were the embodiment of the divine. But that radiance ended in a scene no courtier ever wished to remember. A swollen, rotting body, toothless, and reeking so badly of death that no one dared stand near. This is the secret buried for hundreds of years about Louis the Fourteenth of France. The man called the Sun King was once the perfect model of a monarch, tall, muscular, with skin glowing like the morning light, and black curls as soft and smooth as velvet. He could dance ballet for hours without breaking a single drop of sweat. And with just a single step past, foreign envoys would fall silent, forgetting even their greetings. But here is the part history books never tell you. That very golden god of Versailles would become a mass of decaying flesh, weighing over 1 quintal, with breath so foul that even scented masks could not help, making foreign diplomats vomit right in the middle of royal audiences. I hold in my hands medical records and secret documents that capture this terrifying transformation in full detail, things French historians have tried to conceal for more than 4 centuries. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and the current time where you are. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Louis the Fourteenth, later known to the world as the Sunday King, was born on September 5th, 1638, at the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye, near Paris. He was the son of King Louis the Fourteenth of France and Queen Anne of Austria. His birth was considered a miracle, as for more than 20 years of marriage, his parents had no children, causing the court to fear a succession crisis. Because of this, when Louis was born, he was called Louis, Dieu donné, Louis, the gift of God. His childhood was intertwined with major upheavals in the country. Under Louis the Fourteenth, royal authority was still heavily influenced by the nobility and the church. When his father died in 1643, Louis the Fourteenth was only 5 years old. His mother, Queen Anne, became regent with the support of Cardinal Mazarin. It was a turbulent period when France faced war, financial crisis, and a noble rebellion known as La Fronde. This uprising left a deep impression on Louis about the dangers of sharing power, and later he resolved to keep all authority in his own hands. As a boy, Louis was not only raised to become a king, but was also trained in many fields: foreign languages, history, mathematics, horseback riding, dancing, and swordsmanship. He stood out for his quick learning ability and extraordinary memory. His tutors recounted that the young prince could memorize long passages after only a few readings and always displayed confidence far beyond his years. Louis also received formal artistic education. With a particular love for music and theatre elements, he would later incorporate into court ceremonies, turning Versailles into a grand stage to glorify royal power. In 1651, at only 13 years old, Louis was officially recognized as king, but real power remained in the hands of Cardinal Mazarin until his death in 1661. From that moment, Louis decided there would be no more prime ministers. He would personally manage all affairs of the state. This was the beginning of the famous absolute monarchy in European history, marked by his legendary statement, "L'État, c'est moi." I am the state. M's for entering young adulthood. Louis devoted time not only to state matters but also to cultivating his personal image. He trained daily, rode horses, hunted, and danced to maintain peak fitness. Contemporary records described him as a young man about 1 meter, 75 tall, with a strong, muscular build, broad shoulders, smooth radiant skin, and black curls as glossy as silk. His sharp blue eyes, combined with a confident demeanor and deep voice, made him unforgettable to anyone he met. Louis was also renowned for his rare linguistic talent, fluent in French, Latin, Italian, Spanish, and German. This erudition allowed him to converse with foreign envoys without an interpreter, earning their admiration and wariness. More than a man of letters, Louis was a master swordsman. At 20, he duelled and defeated renowned Italian fencing masters. Considered Europe's elite at the time, his stamina was nearly superhuman. He could hunt wild boars for 8 consecutive hours, then return to the palace and dance until 3 in the morning without tiring. All these qualities made Louis, in the eyes of courtiers and subjects, a legendary figure. He was not only a king but also a symbol of perfection in intellect, physique, and presence. Then, one spring day, when he turned 23, Versailles witnessed a moment that those present would never forget. At the newly refurbished palace, Louis appeared at the top of a white marble staircase, where the golden glow of crystal chandeliers reflected off each step. Draped over him was a robe embroidered with pure gold thread, weighing 15 kilograms, yet he wore it as lightly as if it was silk. At the foot of the stairs, 5,000 nobles held their breath as he walked through the Hall of Mirrors, where hundreds of mirrors reflected his image endlessly, creating the illusion of a god striding through time. His warm, commanding voice resonated through the grand hall, his bright blue eyes likened to shooting stars, piercing the soul. Each step he took made the wooden floors of Versailles tremble, and the scent he carried was not of perfume but of a raw, masculine allure that could unsettle even the most seasoned gentleman. At that moment, Louis was the embodiment of absolute power, beauty, and strength at the height of his youth, an image that no one who witnessed it could ever forget. Louis was also famous for his almost hypnotic allure to women. Secret records of the court reveal that, on average, each month he maintained relationships with at least 12 mistresses, a number that would have shaken all of Versailles had it been made public. Remarkably, it was not only the French nobility, but even the wives and princesses from neighbouring countries who came for audiences and easily found themselves drawn into the pull of those blue eyes and that commanding presence. There were constant whispers about a secret romance between Louis and an Italian musician named Maria Bellini. She had originally been invited to Versailles to perform at a banquet, celebrating a military victory. But when Maria began to sing, Louis halted the entire feast just to listen. After that night, she was invited to remain in the palace under the title of music tutor for the princesses. During those lessons, the king's and Maria's eyes met so often that the ladies-in-waiting had to find ways to distract attention. The romance lasted nearly 2 years, silent like a hidden melody, before Maria was forced to return to Italy due to pressure from the court and the jealousy of other mistresses. Louis's magnetism was so strong that whenever he entered a room, all conversation instantly stopped. Even those who despised him could not bring themselves to respond. A single glance, a smile, or merely the sound of his measured steps across the wooden floors of Versailles was enough to make the crowd step back, parting as though welcoming a deity. Versailles at that time was a splendid stage for a divine performance, choreographed down to the smallest detail. Each morning, more than 100 high-ranking nobles competed for the chance to touch the king's life, from dressing him in the first silk shirt of the day, fastening each button, combing his glossy black curls, to the honor of extinguishing the final candle at night. These rituals were not merely tasks, but symbols of closeness and royal favour, something every noble coveted to elevate their own status. Within the gilded walls and painted ceilings of Versailles, more than 10,000 people lived and worked like actors in a play that lasted a lifetime. Every word spoken, every bow, every step was calculated to glorify Louis's supreme image. Even the marble tiles beneath his feet were imported from Italy at astronomical cost, so that each step he took echoed like a reminder that this was the domain of absolute power. However, amid the lavish banquets and carefully staged displays of authority, the first signs of decline had begun to appear, though at first they were so subtle that no one noticed. Louis began to feel more fatigued after long hunts, and instead of dancing until dawn, he sometimes retired to his chambers earlier. His closest attendants noticed that his complexion had lost some of its radiance, and his eyes no longer shone quite as brightly. Still, no one dared to speak of it. Versailles continued to operate like a vast machine built to glorify the king. The banquets, the dances, the processions went on, and Louis remained the centre of every gaze. Yet beneath the glittering facade, a silent storm was gathering, one that even those nearest to him could not yet imagine would forever alter the image of this legendary monarch. Louis's glorious years continued to pass in the dazzling light of Versailles, where every gaze was directed toward him with admiration, reverence, and at times, désir. He was the centre of every conversation, the inspiration for paintings, music, and even secret rumours. But just as a magnificent stage always requires a solid backstage, behind the lavish ceremonies, the gold-embroidered garments, and the all-night dances, there existed another side to the king's life, one that few outside his most loyal attendants ever witnessed. If in the public eye, Louis was the embodiment of perfection, then behind closed doors, he was still just a man of flesh and blood, with needs and habits that were not always pleasant. There were even things the court worked tirelessly to conceal, for they completely contradicted the divine image Versailles sought to project. And over time, these secrets became crucial pieces in explaining the slow but inevitable downfall of the most powerful monarch in Europe. Secret records from the royal physician, decoded in 1987, revealed a truth that shocked historians and the public alike. As early as the age of 20, Louis had to undergo 2 to 3 enemas a day to cope with chronic constipation. The cause did not stem from any congenital illness, but rather from his own excessive eating habits, 6 to 8 meals a day, each one a lavish banquet filled with various red meats, pastries, and fine wines. Louis's breath, according to the notes, was so unpleasant that his close attendants had to keep mint or herbs on hand for him to chew before important audiences. His skin was often oily and blemished, something considered unbecoming for a king, so he was forced to mask it with thick layers of white powder and red rouge, creating the perfect appearance in the eyes of the court. But in reality, serving as a facade for an unspoken problem, his digestive system was in constant turmoil, to the point of requiring near-daily medical attention. Yet perhaps the most surprising detail for posterity was Louis's personal hygiene habits. He almost never bathed apart from washing his hands and face daily. His entire body was scrubbed only a few times in his whole life. For Louis, this was not an act of laziness, but a deeply held belief rooted in the medical views of the time. In the 17th century, many believed that water could weaken the body or even open the door to evil spirits or disease. Louis, in his own conviction, went further. He believed that natural body odor was a symbol of masculine strength and proof of divine favor. This belief not only led him to forego bathing, but also made him proud of his scent, seeing it as part of his authority. However, over time, that belief became a slow-burning fuse, quietly leading to a tragedy that Versailles would never forget. While the dances and banquets continued outside, inside the king's body, the accumulation of indulgent eating habits and minimal hygiene was silently creating serious health problems. These problems, at first seemingly minor, would gradually become the cause of a series of painful and humiliating events, dimming the brilliance of the Sunday King day by day. In January of 1686, at the age of 47, Louis began to feel a dull discomfort whenever he sat down. At first, the symptom was only a fleeting ache, enough to make him frown, but not enough to alarm Versailles. The royal physician, Guy Crescent Fagan, who had cared for the king's health for many years, examined him and initially diagnosed hemorrhoids, a fairly common and, at the time, not particularly serious ailment. However, the truth was entirely different. This was the beginning of 3 consecutive decades of unrelenting pain, mingled with humiliation that even a monarch could scarcely conceal. Within just 1 week, the discomfort turned into a stabbing pain, as if a knife were driven straight into his lower body. A walnut-sized swelling appeared, inflamed and red, and began to bleed. The blood not only seeped into his undergarments, but also clung persistently to the king's lavish gold-embroidered robes, leaving stains that forced attendants to change his clothes frequently. A strange odour began to emerge, not as sharp as sweat or wine, but a faint, fishy stench that seemed to emanate from his body and linger in the enclosed corridors of the palace. In less than a month, the situation worsened. An external abscess formed right next to his anus, swollen and filled with pus. And worst of all, it began to leak fluid mixed with fecal matter almost constantly. The discomfort had now turned into constant torture. Louis could not sit on the throne for long without grimacing, and each step he took was accompanied by a burning, stabbing sensation. The foul odour from the abscess quickly spread everywhere, becoming an invisible shadow that followed the king wherever he went. Diplomats at audiences discreetly covered their noses. Some, unable to endure it, requested to leave early, and a few even vomited in the middle of ceremonies. Versailles, once accustomed to the scent of flowers and fragrant woods, now faced an invasive, haunting stench that no perfume or incense could mask. In response, Fagan decided to apply medieval-style treatments he believed would be effective. The first was a daily regimen of cold enemas, hoping to reduce swelling and prevent infection. But this was not a short-term measure. It continued for 6 straight months, totaling over 2,000 enemas. Each session brought a bone-chilling cold, accompanied by sharp pain when the tube touched the inflamed abscess. However, instead of improving, Louis's condition deteriorated. The swelling did not subside but spread further, with more pus and blood oozing out. Mild fevers began to appear, leaving him lethargic and irritable. Fagan, fearful of losing both his reputation and his life if he failed to save the king, resorted to an even more extreme measure, pressing a red-hot iron directly onto the infected area in the hope of burning out the disease. The scene resembled an act of torture more than a medical procedure. The glowing iron was brought close, its scorching heat filling the room, and the moment it touched the flesh, the hiss of burning skin echoed alongside Louis's roar of agony. Attendants were forced to hold the king's arms and legs so he would not jerk away from the treatment table. The smell of burning flesh mixed with pus and blood made many in the room turn their heads away. What was expected to bring relief only left Louis more exhausted. The burn wound layered over the unhealed abscess created a necrotic patch that was difficult to recover from. Versailles was no longer the perfect symbol of grandeur. Instead, rumours of the king's failing health began to leak, whispered over wine and slowly spreading to the courts of Europe. During this time, Louis still tried to maintain audiences and banquets, but his eyes grew duller, his smile more forced, and his once commanding gestures were now replaced by slow, cautious movements due to the pain. The court tried everything to conceal his suffering, from changing the room's fragrance, adding special cushions to the throne, to erecting screens so he could stand instead of sit. But those observant enough could tell the Sunday King was beginning to fade from within. Ironically, while artists, poets, and architects continued to praise him as an immortal symbol of power and greatness, his own body had become a battlefield of pain, stench, and helplessness in the face of human biological limits. What began as a slight discomfort when sitting had opened the door to 3 decades of days, both agonizing and humiliating, a dark chapter that no painter dared depict, and no musician dared play in the grand halls of Versailles. Louis's scream that day did not merely echo through the 3 floors of Versailles, it was seared into the memory of all who witnessed it. The hiss of red-hot metal meeting inflamed flesh produced a sickening sizzle, mingling with the stench of blood, pus, and charred skin, a grotesque combination no court painter would dare depict. Yet the cruel irony was that after all this agony, his condition not only failed to improve, but worsened. Royal physician Guy Crescent Fagan, gripped by fear of losing both his reputation and his life, decided to continue with another treatment. The medical world of the time held in absolute faith, bloodletting to balance the humours. Each day, more than half a litre of Louis's blood was drawn, quickly driving him into a state of exhaustion. His face turned pale. His lips lost all colour. His eyes sank deep into their sockets, and his breathing grew faint. Every morning, before attending to matters of state, Louis endured this painful ritual, spending the rest of the day drifting through the palace like a gilded ghost. While Fagan clung to traditional methods, news of the king's affliction spread across France, drawing a wave of miracle healers and charlatans to Versailles. They brought bizarre remedies, tinged with superstition and horror. One suggested using bull semen mixed with red wine to restore masculine vitality. Another ground pearls into fresh bull's blood, convinced the concoction would purify the blood and dissolve the abscess. Yet another offered jars of frog fat soaked in brandy, swearing that regular application would make the ailment vanish like foam on water. Remarkably, in his desperate bid to maintain the image of the invincible Sunday king, Louis accepted them all. He drank, applied, soaked, and submitted to each experiment as though each might be the miracle to save him. But no miracle came. Day after day, the abscess swelled larger, pus seeped more freely, and the pain refused to relent. By November of 1686, the situation had escalated into a true diplomatic crisis. The odour emanating from the king's body, once confined to the corridors, now seeped into banquets and diplomatic audiences. Ambassadors from Spain, the Netherlands, and England all found excuses to cut their visits short. Some openly complained after leaving the palace, fueling rumours across Europe about Louis's health and the stench of death surrounding him. The final attempt to preserve royal dignity was to seek a decisive solution. After tense deliberations, the court resolved surgery was the only option. The problem was that no one in France had ever successfully performed such an operation. The man chosen was not a doctor at all, but Charles-François Félix, the king's personal barber, renowned for his skill with a razor and scissors, but utterly inexperienced in operating on a perianal abscess. This decision was a gamble with life and death. If Félix succeeded, he would be celebrated throughout France as the man who saved the Sun King, richly rewarded and immortalized in history. But if he failed, execution awaited his death, little different from a public spectacle. To prepare, Félix was granted the grim privilege of practicing on condemned prisoners, prisoners of war, and the poor, sick of Paris, an offer no one dared refuse. For refusal meant defying a royal command. For months, Félix trained relentlessly, studying every medical text available and observing each practice operation with meticulous care. Versailles became a fortress under lockdown, where all news of the king's condition was tightly controlled. Yet beyond its gilded walls, The people whispered of a once glorious monarch now tormented by a foul disease and subjected to horrifying treatments. Louis, though aware of the risk, maintained his proud facade. He continued to appear in gold-embroidered attire, draped in long cloaks, wearing gloves scented with musk, as if illness were nothing more than idle gossip. But beneath the lavish fabric lay a body wasted away, weary, and a wound that tormented him every waking moment. Each step he took, each time he sat down, became a trial of both body and spirit. Entrusting his life to a barber who had never performed this surgery revealed not only his desperation but also the era's blind faith in hands, guided by God. Felix, fully aware that his fate hung between glory and death, swore he would not let his blade tremble when the moment arrived. And so, in the heart of a bitter winter, Versailles prepared for an unprecedented event. Surgery on the sun. King a gamble whose outcome would determine not only Louis's survival, but the very image of invincibility he had built over decades. No one knew whether his light would blaze once more or be extinguished under the blade of his most trusted barber. That winter, all of Versailles seemed to hold its breath. Every gaze was fixed on Charles-François Felix, the royal barber, who had now become the Sun King's sole scalpel. After months of preparation, he had performed 75 practice surgeries on prisoners, captives, and destitute volunteers willing to endure the pain in exchange for a few coins or a meal. There was no anesthesia, no true antiseptic. The unfortunate subjects were bound tightly, their sweat and tears mingling with blood, their screams echoing down the dim corridors of the infirmary. Yet every failed operation, every misplaced cut became a lesson. Felix etched into his memory as if carving it into bone. Knowing that Louis's body was a labyrinth of unpredictable damage, Felix crafted a special blade with his own hands. It was a silver scalpel, the curved edge as delicate as a bird's beak, designed to slip into the deepest pockets of the abscess without harming the healthy tissue. Silver, in the belief of the time, was not only precious, but also guarded against corruption fitting. They thought, for something that would touch the king's flesh. On the morning of the surgery, a lead-grey sky cast a cold mist over the palace. Inside the sealed chamber, 4 burly nobles stood ready to hold the monarch's frail body still. Louis lay on his side, his opulent robe cut away, exposing pale skin and the swollen, pus-filled wound. A wooden block was wedged into his mouth, not to muffle his cries, but to keep him from biting his tongue when the pain struck. When Felix placed the scalpel at the site, the room sank into a deathly silence. The first incision made Louis arch like he'd been struck by lightning, his cry shattering the air. The sound tore through 3 floors of the palace, sending a shiver through the servants standing outside. Versailles had never heard such roar, desperate screaming from its sovereign. The operation lasted 3 hours, a relentless ordeal. Each time the blade probed deeper, Felix had to stop to wipe away blood and pus. When he reached the deepest part of the abscess, a thick, foul fluid burst forth, carrying a stench so overpowering it made 2 assistants seasoned in surgery vomit and flee. Felix was left alone to face the chaos. Blood soaked the bedsheets, staining the mattress beneath. Louis bit the wooden block so hard it splintered, a piece lodging between his teeth. The surgical notes, discovered in 2007 in the medical archives, described the scene. More than 200 milliliters of thick, green pus, reeking like a corpse left to rot in summer heat. While cleaning the cavity, Felix found areas of bone already necrotic, stark against the eroded tissue. But no matter how harrowing the sight, Felix's hands stayed steady as steel. He knew a single tremor could cost the king his life through massive blood loss. Every movement, every cut was measured in fractions. Guided by the dozens of practice runs before, the nobles restraining Louis were drenched in sweat, Yet none dared loosen their grip for fear a sudden movement might ruin everything. Beyond the closed doors, advisors, servants, and guards waited in tense silence. The king's cries leaked out along with the faint odour of blood and decay. Blanching the faces of those nearby, some priests prayed quietly, begging God to guide Felix's hand and spare the monarch's soul should the worst come to pass. As the surgery neared its end, Felix began to stitch the incisions with coarse thread. No anaesthetic to dull the pain. Louis, nearly unconscious from exhaustion, still shuddered with each prick of the needle. At last, with the wound bandaged, Felix straightened, his hands and apron drenched in blood. He made no declaration of triumph, only a small nod to the nobles, a signal that the king still lived. The chamber was then sealed for cleaning. Servants brought basins of warm, scented water to scrub the floor. Yet the stench of death clung to the stones. Louis was laid to rest, his face wax pale, lips cracked, but eyes still faintly open, a gaze both weary and resolute. Outside, news began to ripple through Versailles. The Sun King had survived the surgery. Sighs of relief mingled with the lingering horror of the bloody morning. For some, it was proof of Louis's courage. For others, a reminder that even a king was flesh and blood, capable of suffering and weakness like any man. From that day forward, Charles-François Felix was no longer just a barber. He was the man who had driven a blade deep into the Sun King's body and pulled him back from the brink of death. But Felix himself knew the battle was far from over, and that Versailles, with all its splendour, would yet witness many more painful chapters in Louis the Fourteenth's tragedy. That winter, the nightmare did not end after the bloody morning. The first surgery only temporarily eased the pain but could not heal the wound. Louis's injury was too deep, too complex, and had invaded parts of the body that could not be stitched shut. Pus continued to seep out daily, and the pain never subsided. The physicians conferred, and Felix quietly nodded. The operations had to continue, even though each one was a gamble with life and death. In December of that year, 3 additional surgeries were performed in succession. On the 6th, the 8th, and the 10th, the final operation was the most dreadful, lasting a full 6 hours, with 6 strong men holding down the king's frail body. Felix, with hands steady as steel, cut away chunks of dead flesh that had changed colour, grown soft, and emitted an indescribable stench. Records state that the total amount of tissue removed filled an entire wineglass, an image so horrifying that even the bravest could not forget it. Over the course of 3 weeks, Louis endured a total of 15 hours of surgery, while fully conscious, without anesthesia, without mercy. Each stroke of the blade brought beads of sweat to his brow, blood soaking the bed sheets, and muffled groans, stifled by the wooden bite blocks between his teeth. The relentless agony drained his body, and although he survived, the wound never fully healed. The result was a permanent anal fistula, from which pus and feces seeped daily, slowly eroding both his health and the dignity of a monarch once hailed as the embodiment of perfection. To conceal the shame of his condition, Louis was forced to wear an absorbent pad beneath his golden robes. His once majestic strides through the grand halls were now accompanied by a constant dampness and an undercurrent of foul odour. The luxurious fragrance that had once inspired awe among the court was now replaced by the heavy stench of decay, one that no amount of perfume could entirely mask. In desperation, Louis transformed Versailles into a colossal machine for producing and dispersing scent. He spent the equivalent of 2 million modern-day U.S. dollars annually solely on perfume and the world's rarest aromatic ingredients. Bottles of Bulgarian rose oil were transported across continents. Arabian amber was ground into fine powder, and Indian sandalwood was carved into blocks to be burned for fragrance. The palace became a sanctuary of scent. Fresh flowers were replaced every 2 hours, day or night, to ensure that not a single petal wilted. Silver censers pumped fragrant smoke through the corridors, creating a thin, hazy veil that was both dreamy and overpowering. Upholstery fabric was soaked in essential oils, and even the tablecloths and curtains carried traces of costly perfume. The king's meals were soaked or infused with essential oils, partly to please his palate, partly to drown out the faint but persistent odor of decay emanating from his body. By this time, Versailles had become a strange fusion of splendor and rot. From afar, the palace still blazed with light, the pinnacle of European power and refinement, but inside, each expensive fragrance was merely a curtain drawn over a stark truth. The Sun King was rotting from within, and the entire court was complicit in performing a grand olfactory charade. Foreign visitors to Versailles were often stunned by the pervasive, intoxicating aroma that filled every corner. They praised the sophistication of the French royal household, but long-serving attendants knew the truth. This was not just luxury, it was despair distilled into scent. Each bottle of perfume, each bouquet of fresh flowers, each curl of fragrant smoke was an unspoken admission that the body of France's greatest king was no longer whole. Louis knew this better than anyone. On winter nights, when the corridors were dark and only the flicker of candlelight remained beside his bed, the rich fragrance seemed to dissolve, yielding to the cold, honest smell of illness. In those moments, he understood that no throne, no palace, no ceremony could shield a man from the ravages of time and disease. The echoes of those surgeries did not remain solely on Louis the Fourteenth's body as a permanent wound. They spread like a toxic haze, seeping into his mind, the court, and ultimately into the very structure of power Versailles had once embodied. From a living symbol of absolute strength, the king gradually became a fragile silhouette, haunted by the betrayal of his own body, something he had once believed to be invincible. Each morning, when the first light poured through the massive glass windows, Louis no longer stepped from his bed with the pride of old. Instead, he would lie still for a long while, feeling the constant ache from his anal fistula and the dampness beneath his padded garments. It was not merely a personal humiliation. It was a reminder that no crown could erase the frailty of flesh. The courtiers, though trained to mask their reactions, could not always hide the quick, sidelong glances or the muffled whispers hastily cut short when he entered a room. Versailles, built as a colossal stage for the perfection of the Sun King, now felt like a mouldy theatre where the play had to go on, even though the leading actor had lost much of his vitality. Ceremonious, banquet, and rituals still unfolded on schedule. But the air had changed. Every bouquet, every waft of incense drifting through the grand halls was no longer just a mark of opulence. It was a perfumed curtain hiding a secret. Everyone knew, but no one dared to speak aloud. The psychological toll on Louis ran deeper than any cut from a surgeon's blade. He became suspicious of compliments, wary of loyalty, and obsessed with controlling his public image. Audiences grew shorter, royal inspections were reduced, and he rarely allowed anyone to stand too close. No longer the monarch striding through corridors, under 1,000 adoring eyes. He began living like a prisoner within his own palace, surrounded by mirrors and fragrance. Politics felt the strain as well. Factions within the court sensed the king's vulnerability and began vying for influence. Major decisions were delayed or swayed by cunning courtiers. Versailles, once the heart of absolute power, turned into a silent battlefield, with intrigue playing out behind velvet curtains and the gentle notes of harp music. Beyond the palace walls, rumours of Louis's health spread through Paris and across Europe's courts. Foreign envoys, once received in dazzling splendour, returned home with vague tales of a weakened monarch, always cloaked in a suffocating haze of perfume. Political rivals whispered that the Sun King was fading and that his light could flicker out at any moment. Worst of all, Louis knew it. On sleepless nights, He sat alone before a map of France, thinking of the wars, the buildings, the treaties, each a block of gold, now showing hairline cracks. He understood that a king's power lay not only in armies or palaces, but in the unshakable image he projected. And when that image wavered, so did the throne. To hold on to power, Louis chose the only path he knew, to keep playing the Sun King. He still appeared in gilded robes, still issued decrees in his deep, resonant voice, still smiled before the eyes of his subjects. But beneath the silk and gold thread, he carried a pain that never ceased, and a shadow within him that grew larger by the day. Versailles, to outsiders, remained the pinnacle of art and authority, but to those within, it was a suffocating world of guarded secrets, where fragrance concealed truth, and every gaze carried the knowledge that their king was fighting not only a disease, but the fading reflection in his own mirror. At this time, Versailles had truly become a colossal perfume machine, operating day and night to mask the king's body odor. But that luxurious fragrance could not hide the truth. The body of Louis the Fourteenth was only just beginning its journey of collapse. In the early 1690s, his weight skyrocketed from 77 kilograms to more than 140 kilograms. The ornate thrones, crafted from fine oak and gilded with gold, had to be replaced 3 times to withstand his enormous mass. When he needed to go out, Louis could no longer ride a horse with the majesty of his youth. Instead, 6 strong guards had to lift him onto the saddle together and hold him steady during every parade. The court painters, whose livelihoods depended on glorifying the immortal aura of the Sunday King, were now ordered to portray him only from his best angles, avoiding any view that revealed his bloated body and heavy gait. But to foreign envoys, that layer of grandeur was hard to conceal. A Russian ambassador, after attending an audience, recorded with biting sarcasm that the king smelled worse than a horse and waddled like a pregnant cow. That rumour spread across the courts of Europe, becoming a lingering humiliation to Louis's image of absolute power. In 1693, another medical disaster struck, like a second dagger into his pride, a dental catastrophe. At that time, the royal physicians firmly believed that all illnesses in the body originated from the mouth, and to achieve complete purification, they decided on a horrifying procedure removing all of the king's teeth in a single session. No anesthesia, no advanced dental techniques, only iron pliers and brute force. The chilling sounds of cracking echoed in the audience chamber. Temporarily converted into a surgical room, blood gushed profusely, mingling with the metallic scent and the inherent stench of the oral cavity. The pain was so intense that the king's joints contracted, his fingers digging into the armrest of the chair until the skin tore. When the final tooth was yanked out, the horrifying aftermath became clear. The upper jaw was fractured, the lower jaw broken, creating an opening between the mouth and the nasal cavity. From then on, whenever he ate or drank, food and wine would not only go down his throat, but also spurt out through his nose, turning any banquet in Louis's presence into a visual ordeal for those seated across from him. The royal physicians, instead of admitting fault, regarded it as a necessary adjustment, and advised the king to consume special soups mixed with strong fragrances to mask the odour and make swallowing easier. But no scent was strong enough to overpower the revulsion caused by that sight. At each royal audience, the courtiers maintained a composed expression, yet their hands always clutched scented cloths, raising them discreetly to their noses whenever Louis spoke. From that point on, Versailles was not only a palace of power, but also a stage where everyone played their part in a grand performance to conceal the truth. Their king was being betrayed by his own body, bit by bit. In the dazzling light of the throne, after the dental disaster, Louis the Fourteenth's voice became distorted and difficult to understand. The once resonant, commanding syllables of a monarch were now muffled and constricted, as if forced through a throttled throat. envoys had to lean in, straining to catch a few words, often reading his lips to guess the meaning. Saliva flowed constantly, dripping onto his robe and soaking into the gold-embroidered collar, leaving dark stains that even the most skilled launderers of Versailles struggled to remove. This condition, combined with the anal fistula that had plagued him for years and his massive obesity, transformed the image of the Sunday King, the very emblem of majesty and the beauty of power, into that of a living caricature. Along the gilded corridors, one could see a monarch panting, sodden, and trailed by a heavy, lingering odour with every step. To prevent his image from collapsing entirely in the eyes of courtiers and foreign guests, Versailles established more than 200 new, elaborate rituals designed solely to conceal the king's deteriorating health. One of the strangest innovations was a colour-coded ribbon system hung outside his chambers. A red ribbon meant, "Stay away, no one, not even close attendance, was allowed to enter." A white ribbon signalled that entry was permitted but required wearing a mask soaked in perfume. And a black ribbon meant absolutely no entry, reserved for moments when the king's odour was overwhelming or he faced an acute health crisis. Daily ceremonies were also drastically altered. The morning ritual, which once lasted 2 hours and drew dozens of nobles eager to witness the king don his regalia, was shortened to 30 minutes to spare him the discomfort and fatigue of standing or sitting too long. The evening ceremony, formerly a grand moment to bid farewell to the court, was replaced by a secret procedure in which trusted attendants would quickly insert a pad into the king's undergarments to prevent soiling his clothes. Thick velvet curtains were set up around the bed, not for decoration, but to shield prying eyes when servants changed the soiled sheets. Windows throughout the palace were opened on a strict schedule to help disperse the unpleasant odours before guests were admitted. Perfume became the primary weapon in the war against the stench. Each day, the palace received 500 fresh flowers, replaced constantly to ensure a steady supply of new fragrance. 50 incense burners operated without pause, releasing thick clouds of scented smoke that seeped into every corner. Every velvet drape and every cushioned chair, the scents of orange blossom, sandalwood, and musk mingled into an invisible haze, yet still failed to fully mask the truth seeping from the king's body. The nobles who were obliged to remain near him devised their own coping methods. They carried small silver pomanders filled with aromatic spices, discreetly raising them to their noses when necessary. Diplomats preferred handkerchiefs soaked in essential oils, which could be politely lifted to the face under the guise of coughing while blocking the foul air. Ladies of the court, more sensitive to odours, often feigned dizziness to step outside, where they could discreetly vomit before returning with composed faces as though nothing had happened. By this point, Versailles was no longer merely the palace of power. It had become a vast machine operating day and night to maintain the illusion that the Sunday King still shone bright and invincible. But beneath that dazzling facade, every ritual, every flower, and every wisp of scented smoke was only delaying the inevitable moment when the entire court and all of Europe would recognize that the light was fading, and no perfume on earth could hold it back. Louis the Fourteenth's deteriorating health was not merely an internal matter for Versailles. It quickly became a topic of gossip in European diplomatic circles. Audiences that had once been opportunities for ambassadors to show respect and strengthen relations now became burdensome due to the king's stench, laboured breathing, and heavy, awkward gait. The British ambassador, known for his tact, claimed that his doctor advised against enclosed spaces and requested that negotiations be held outdoors, under the palace's tree-lined avenues, or in its gardens. Even so, he always kept a careful distance, avoiding any breeze that might carry the odour. The Spanish envoy was more discreet but equally clear. Instead of appearing in person, he sent a lower-ranking representative to ceremonies, citing urgent matters in Paris. Rumours from Versailles spread like wildfire through Europe's courts. In Vienna, whispers circulated, if the king cannot control his own body, how can he control an empire? In London, the nobility used cutting metaphors, calling him the half-set sun or light-through perfume. Paris was full of murmurs, and though courtiers tried to conceal the truth, it still leaked out through every closed door. Yet Louis the Fourteenth did not retreat. On the contrary, he clung to absolute power like a drowning man clutching the last plank in a vast sea. The weaker his body became, the thicker the mask of authority he constructed. Court ceremonies became his stage, and he was the leading actor, using every gesture and every word to assert that he was still the untouchable Sunday king. During audiences, he sat upright, despite the ache in his bones, fixed his gaze on his counterpart, and maintained a cadence of command in his warped speech. Public ceremonies were grander than ever, not to celebrate victories or sign treaties, but to display the enduring strength of a dynasty that still stood. Eyebrow. Behind the scenes, however, a cruel truth advanced step by step. In August of 1715, at 4:30 in the morning, Versailles was pierced by a scream that shattered the night. Louis, lying in a bed, draped in red velvet, clutched his left leg and cried out in agony. He described the sensation as if a fire were consuming his foot and creeping up toward his calf. Alarmed courtiers called for Antoine Daquin, but he had been dead for years. His successor, Dr. Fagin, now 72 years old and nearly blind, limped in, leaning on a cane, and tried to examine the king under the dim candlelight. After a brief touch, and hearing the description, Fagin diagnosed sciatica, a common ailment among the elderly. But he was wrong. In reality, something far more serious was unfolding in the king's body. Dry gangrene had begun to ravage his left leg. Louis's body, already weakened by years of illness, could no longer fight the blood flow blockage in his lower limb. Only a few days later, when courtiers changed his stockings, they found a small black spot on his big toe, like a drop of ink, staining pale skin. The spot was painless but cold and dry, a warning sign of tissue death. Despite his failing eyesight, Fagin recognized the omen. Rather than announcing it publicly, he confided in a select circle of trusted courtiers, advising them to prepare themselves. The warning spread quickly through Versailles, darkening the already heavy atmosphere. Ceremonies continued, but the gaze of those in attendance had changed. They no longer looked at Louis as an immortal monarch, but as a candle burned nearly to its end, waiting for the final gust of wind. From that day on, the pain in Louis's left leg never subsided, even with massages, herbal compresses, or opium to dull the agony. He would often startle awake in the night, moaning softly, cold sweat beading across his brow. Yet every morning, as daylight flooded the room, the king draped himself in lavish robes, adorned himself with medals, and took his place on the throne so the court could see that the Sunday king still shone. The cost of maintaining this image drained his strength at a terrifying pace. Physicians urged amputation of the necrotic tissue to save his life. But Louis, who despised the surgeon's knife, refused outright. He believed that a king crowned by God could not allow his body to be violated by human blades. This decision would, in the end, seal his fate within only a few short weeks. In mid-August, the air in Versailles, already suffocating with the scent of perfumes, sweat, and sickness, was torn apart by a new smell. A thick, overpowering, haunting stench of human flesh in decay. It began in the left foot, with a burning sensation spreading across the skin, as though thousands of needles were stabbing at once. The skin grew taut and red, then quickly turned a deep purple. Even the slightest movement made Louis grit his teeth. Yet he forced himself to keep his back straight and his gaze commanding whenever he appeared before the court. The royal physicians and courtiers knew all too well. That smell was an unmistakable sign gangrene had entered its irreversible stage. But Versailles was a place where every action followed ritual, and such rituals did not permit anyone to directly suggest removing a part of the one chosen by God. In Louis's world, taking a blade to the king's body was akin to insulting the throne itself. The doctors, though fully aware that surgery might save his life, kept silent, communicating only through heavy, troubled glances. On August 25th, the disease had spread halfway up the shin. The flesh from the knee down had changed colour and began oozing a dark fluid, its odour so strong that servants would feel dizzy and unsteady the moment they opened the door. Some fainted outright on the carpet and had to be dragged away. The king's chamber doors were kept shut almost all day, and braziers were loaded with extra aromatic oils to mask the truth. But the stench of death still seeped through the cracks, drifting down the gilded corridors. 3 days later, on the morning of August 28th, as two elderly attendants carefully removed Louis's socks, they were met with a peculiar lightness. The socks slid off, and the king's big toe, completely consumed by gangrene, fell to the floor with a faint, brittle sound. The white of bone gleamed starkly against the backdrop of flesh gone black, freezing the entire room into silence. No one dared cry out, yet trembling hands betrayed their horror. The toe was wrapped in silk and secretly buried, as though concealing a matter of state. By August 30th, the gangrene had devoured the entire lower leg. Chunks of rotting flesh detached from the bone, dropping onto the bed and revealing raw gaps weeping pale yellow fluid. Each time the area was cleaned, the servants had to clamp their noses tightly, while the physicians fortified themselves with strong liquor before entering. Versailles was no longer the palace of light, but a vast funeral hall, where a king still lived, yet decayed more each day. And still, Louis, with his iron will and obsession with power, refused to abandon his role, his hand trembling. He continued to sign decrees, the lines of his writing twisting like threads on the verge of snapping. His voice was hoarse, the infection slowly creeping toward his throat. But he continued to summon generals, issuing military orders as if war and politics still rested firmly in his grasp. In those moments, those around him felt both terror and an inexplicable pull. Before their eyes was a body rotting away, a man reduced to skin and bone, yet authority radiated from him like the final light of the sun before it sets. Versailles continued to function with all its rituals intact, but everyone understood. Each signature, each command now was like a testament written in the midst of the stench of death. A Venetian ambassador wrote, "The King of France is dying before our very eyes." An Austrian envoy called it the most horrifying sight he had ever witnessed. And yet, the machinery of court ritual moved on as if nothing had changed. The bed linens were replaced every 2 hours. An endless procession of fresh sheets, soaked almost immediately with the fluids seeping from the monarch's disintegrating body. 20 attendants worked in rotating shifts to manage the task, their faces pale with exhaustion and revulsion. Many petitioned to be reassigned. Others simply vanished from Versailles without a word. The stench had grown so potent that it drifted through the grand halls, down the sweeping marble staircases, and into the manicured gardens of the palace. Even the fountains, perfumed with oils in a desperate attempt to mask the odour, could not erase the sour taint of rot that now clung to the air. Visitors from across Europe arrived not with remedies or hopes of saving the son, king, but to bear witness to a death unlike any the continent had seen. Diplomats, physicians, and spies crowded into antechambers, exchanging whispers and letters they would later send back to Vienna, London, Madrid, and Venice, each account tinged with both horror and fascination. For the doctors, the king's body had become a kind of morbid theatre. They debated symptoms in hushed tones, took careful note of the rate at which the gangrene advanced, and recorded each change in colour, texture, and odour for the foreign dignitaries. It was a political omen, the slow-motion collapse of the man who had dominated European affairs for more than 7 decades. By August's final night, Louis could scarcely lift his head from the pillows. His once commanding voice had thinned to a strained rasp, each word dragging across his swollen throat. The infection had reached his neck, pressing upward toward the base of his skull. Even the simple act of swallowing water brought on visible shudders of pain. Yet, when ministers and generals approached his bedside to seek orders, he would raise a trembling hand, nod faintly, and attempt to speak, as if the kingdom itself might fracture, should he fall silent. On the morning of September 1st, the light in the royal chamber was dim, filtered through heavy curtains to protect his failing eyes. Courtiers stood at a cautious distance, their silks and velvets absorbing the heavy air. Those nearest to the bed could see that his lips moved with difficulty, his breath ragged and shallow, summoning the last reserves of his strength. Louis gestured for a boy to be brought forward, his great-grandson, the Dauphin, a child who would soon inherit the crown as Louis the 15th. The room fell still, the shuffling of feet and rustle of fabric silenced by the gravity of the moment. The boy, wide-eyed and hesitant, stepped close until he could feel the faint warmth of his great-grandfather's breath. Louis's hand, thin as parchment, reached out and rested on the child's shoulder. His gaze, clouded, yet still sharp with memory, fixed upon the boy's face. In a whisper barely audible above the low murmur of the chamber, the king spoke his final counsel. "Do not imitate me. I have been too fond of war." The words, carried on a breath that smelled faintly of decay and lavender oil, seemed to hang in the air long after his lips had stilled. Those present would remember the moment, not for its grandeur, but for its stark humanity. Here was the Sun King, once the embodiment of power, glory, and divine right, confessing in the last flicker of life that his greatest love had also been his greatest flaw. And with that, the court understood. The reign of Louis the 14th was no longer measured in days or hours, but in minutes, each one slipping away like sand through the fingers of history. At exactly 8:15 that morning, Louis the 14th exhaled his final breath. But death did not draw a curtain over the horror, it merely ushered in its most grotesque act. In the hours that followed, the gangrene surged, unchecked. Liberated from the slowing resistance of a living body, his abdomen began to swell grotesquely. Inflated by the gases of decomposition, the once pale skin along his flanks and chest deepened to an oily black, and from the folds of his neck, thick, foul-smelling fluid began to seep, staining the linens within minutes. By midday, the chamber that had for decades been the axis of France's political universe was suffocating with the stench of decay. Curtains that once glowed gold in the morning light now hung heavy and oppressive, their brocade fibres absorbing the reek. Courtiers who had stood at his bedside earlier in the day lingered only briefly now, retreating to the far ends of the hall or outside to the gardens to escape the smell. But even the manicured hedges and perfumed fountains could not mask the creeping reach of the odour. 6 hours after the king's death, his physicians' faces drawn, voices, hushed, convened in urgent council. If they delayed the post-mortem examination, the body would disintegrate beyond recognition before the next day's dawn. It was decided. The autopsy must be performed immediately. The heavy drapes were pulled tighter, candles lit despite the hour, and the royal corpse was moved onto a table draped in white linen. What they found beneath the thin, discoloured skin shook even the most experienced among them. The entire left side of his body had succumbed to necrosis. The flesh there softened to a sickly, jelly-like consistency. The muscles of his neck had rotted so completely that the vertebrae showed through in places, slick with decomposition. Opening the abdomen revealed bowels, both small and large, swollen to twice their normal size, pressing against each other in distended knots. And then came the discovery that turned stomachs and drew gasps. Coiled within the bloated intestines lay a parasitic worm nearly 1/2 meter in length, pale and glistening in the candlelight, as if mocking the grandeur that had once clothed this body. The royal embalmers, men hardened by years of tending to the dead, approached their task with grim resolve. But Versailles was not prepared for the truth. The Sun King's remains could not be preserved in any ceremonial fashion. The extent of the rot, the speed of the decay, and the overpowering odour made the process not merely difficult, but impossible. Even masks soaked in potent aromatics, cinnamon, clove, and lavender proved useless. One assistant vomited violently into a bucket before stumbling from the room. Another fainted outright and had to be carried away. The chief embalmer made the only decision left to him. The coffin must be sealed in lead at once. No time for the weeks-long rituals of state funerals. No lavish display of the body for public mourning. The chamberlain issued the order, and a heavy, gleaming coffin was brought in. Its interior lined hastily with cloth to absorb what it could. The body, swaddled in layers of linen, was placed inside. The lid was lowered, soldered shut with molten lead, and then hammered to seal every seam. By nightfall, the great Sun King was no longer in his golden bedchamber, nor laid out for the reverence of his subjects. Instead, he lay entombed in cold metal, hidden from view. His reign concluded not in the blaze of divine glory he had long cultivated, but in the shadow of a swift and pragmatic burial. The court, still reeling from the sight and the smell, moved with hushed urgency. Orders were given for the immediate transport of the coffin to the burial site, before the night air could grow thick with the rumours that already whispered through the halls. The king who had ruled for 72 years, the longest reign in European history, was now a sealed weight of lead, carried quickly away from the palace he had built as a monument to his eternal light. But as the procession slipped quietly out of Versailles, many could not help but think of the final irony. The sun had set not in splendour, but in darkness, its glow smothered by the inevitability of flesh, rot, and the grave. The funeral of Louis the Fourteenth unfolded under a shroud of secrecy. The great bells of Versailles did not toll in triumphant mourning. Instead, the palace's corridors hummed with muffled orders and hurried footsteps. His coffin, sealed in lead only hours after his death, still betrayed the violence of decomposition within. Courtiers close enough to hear swore they caught the faint but unmistakable popping sounds like logs cracking in a fire, accompanied by a wet, fizzing gurgle as gases and fluids pressed against their confinement. The once revered Sun King, even in death, was restless, his body rebelling against the dignity his court so desperately tried to preserve. Outside, the official story began to crystallize. The court's heralds announced that His Majesty had passed peacefully after a brief illness, a comforting fiction meant to steady a nation and shield the monarchy's image from the rot of reality. Behind locked doors, the machinery of erasure roared to life. Every scrap of Dr. Fagan's medical notes was fed to the fire. The meticulous dissection records of Surgeon Felix, an eyewitness to the king's final anatomical ruin, was sealed away for 3 centuries. Even the autopsy report, ink barely dry, vanished into a vault no one outside the inner circle would ever see. Versailles had decided. The Sun King's body might have failed, but his legend would remain spotless. It was an irony too bitter to escape those few who knew the truth. For 72 years, Louis had commanded the most opulent court in Europe, building Versailles into a glittering monument to his own supremacy. He had demanded the total obedience of nobility and clergy alike, brooking no challenge to his authority. He had proclaimed himself chosen by God, the embodiment of the state itself, and yet, when the end came, it stripped him of all such illusions. His death was not the serene passing of a ruler into eternity, but the drawn-out collapse of flesh, decay gnawing at a mind still fully aware, a sovereign forced to feel his own ruin in excruciating detail. This was the man who once made dukes and princes jockey for the privilege of tying his shoelaces, who permitted only the worthiest to kiss his hand. Thousands had bent the knee before him, their faces lit by the reflected glow of his power. But in his final hours, no crowd knelt by his bed. There was no great theatre of devotion, no throng to witness his last breath in reverence. Instead, the room stank so fiercely that even his most loyal attendants fled in shifts, leaving him to die with only the stifled coughs and averted gazes of those who could endure the smell a few moments longer. The body that had once danced in youth, that had led armies and inspired fear across continents, now lay as a vessel of foulness, skin blackened and splitting, limbs seeping fluids. The royal frame collapsing under the weight of its own corruption, perfumed oils and incense, poured and burned in desperate quantities, only mingled with the stench, creating a cloying, nauseating hearts. The rituals of the court continued by rote, but they could not mask the reality. The Sun King's reign had ended not in radiant sunset, but in a slow-motion disintegration. When the coffin finally departed, Versailles under cover of night, it was not the grand procession France might have expected for her monarch. There were no cheering crowds, no endless lines of torchbearers, only a tight cluster of guards and officials accompanied the sealed box, as though hurrying a dangerous secret out of sight. Those who passed close enough would later whisper of the faint heat that seemed to radiate from the lead, of the unsettling tick and crack from within, as if the king still resisted his final confinement. The irony was absolute, and it was merciless. No matter the palaces he had raised, the wars he had won, or the titles he had claimed, Louis the Fourteenth's end was as common as any starving peasant's worse. Perhaps, for he met it with full consciousness, able to comprehend every humiliation his body inflicted on him. In that, he shared a truth older than kingship itself. No crown, no divine right, no human achievement can alter the immutable law of the flesh. It is the law that governs all. The flesh will fail. It will rot. And it will die. And in those final, secret hours of his burial, as the lead coffin was lowered, and the earth closed over the man who once called himself the Sun, Versailles was left with a lesson. It dared not speak aloud that even kings are dust, and even the brightest light must fade into darkness. The story of the final days of Louis the Fourteenth is not only the tragedy of one of the most powerful men in Europe, but also a mirror reflecting the raw truth of the human condition. Though he once sat on the throne for 72 years, commanded armies, built the magnificent Versailles, and forced the entire nobility to kneel in submission, in the end, he could not escape the simplest and most merciless law. All power, all titles, and all splendor fade before the decay of the flesh. Through this video, we see clearly that absolute power does not equate to immortality. Louis the Fourteenth could command an entire nation, yet he could not order his body to halt the process of decline. This reminds each of us that health and time are the most precious treasures, and that no matter one's status, we must live humbly, cherishing simple and human values. The greater lesson lies in how Versailles tried to conceal the truth. The court burned medical records, sealed autopsy results, and fabricated a tale of a peaceful passing to preserve the king's image. This shows that history is sometimes written not to record the truth, but to protect power. And if we are not vigilant, we can easily be drawn into versions of the past created by the powerful. From this, the message the video seeks to convey is: live truthfully with yourself and face reality. No matter how difficult it may be to accept, for the truth, whether hidden or distorted, will always endure. And the value of a person lies not in titles or power, but in how they face the truth and treat others. Louis the Fourteenth left behind a dazzling legacy, but his death left a silent warning. The glow of glory will eventually fade, and what remains is only the true essence of a person. That is what each of us must remember to live a meaningful life, leaving not only palaces of stone, but also a legacy of compassion, kindness, and truth.